Hi everybody and welcome to this week's video of the Simplified opening series. In this video I would like to show you an idea that I learned about only very recently. A few weeks ago I was a guest at the Spanish team championship, the División de Honor, the highest league in Spain, and there were a lot of players, very strong grandmasters playing, and one of them was the Egyptian grandmaster Bassem Amin. And Bassem Amin is a very well-known grandmaster who uses the King's Indian as his main opening with the black pieces, and often uses the King's Indian attack with the white pieces. So in one of his games I encountered a very strange, interesting and early move for white that I hadn't seen before, and at first I was really puzzled why that move was played. But then in discussions with other players I learned of the idea, and actually I was quite impressed by it, and I decided to show it to you. Now before I go to show you the actual idea, I would first like to show you one historical game that will help you understand the depth of the idea. And that historical game features none other than Bobby Fischer. It's actually his game against the Mongolian master Myagmar Suren, played at the SUS Interzonal Tournament in 1967. So let's check this game, and then I will point out the exact moment which is crucial for understanding of this early idea by Grandmaster Amin. So in that game Fischer started with e4, e6 and played the move d3. Fischer was well known for using the King's Indian attack against the French and also sometimes against the Sicilian when black played the move e6 early on. So limiting the activity of the light squared bishop and not allowing e5 in one go. So d3, d5, knight d2, knight f6, g3, c5, bishop g2, knight c6, knight f3, bishop e7, castles, castles. So we have the typical setup of the King's Indian attack for white and the Queen's Gambit declined for black. And this idea that I'm going to show you a bit later on is actually aimed at these against these setups and actually aiming to get them while avoiding another annoying idea by black. But let's not jump ahead of ourselves. So e5 by Fischer, knight d7 and rook e1. The nice aspect of the King's Indian attack when it comes to playing with the white pieces is that it is pretty automatic. So the rook and the knight are defending the pawn on e5, and then what follows is pretty straightforward. The knight comes to f1 to free the path for the bishop to go to f4, from where it also defends the pawn on e5. Then h4 is played, hopefully h5, h6 all the way to h6 to weaken the dark squares around the black king. Then the knight from f1 can join the attack via h2 g4 or e3 g4, or in case of black playing h6 and stopping h6, then the storm g4 g5 may be possible. So these are the main ideas for white. As you could see, there are not that many, they're pretty automatic and it's pretty easy to play. Probably the best part of it is that white is hoping to checkmate black king. And as we shall see, Fischer succeeds in this game. So b5, it's normal play for black. Black will seek counterplay on the queen side. Knight f1, b4, h4, all standard moves. They can be played in different move orders, but it doesn't really affect much as each side is playing on their own wing. a5, bishop f4, a4, and now we come to the critical moment when we need to understand, and we will see the basis of white's idea later in this video. So first we need to understand that what black wants to do here. So his last move was a4, and if left, let's say on their own devices, if white plays something like knight h2 or anything, black will play e3 with the idea to dislodge this pawn from b2, whether by white capturing on a3 or more likely b3 closing the queen side. However, after b3, black has the maneuver knight a7, knight b5 at his disposal, targeting both the c3 and d4 squares, which will be rather weak after white has played b3. So this is the idea that black has in the as a way of attacking and making progress on the queen side. So with this in mind, Now you shouldn't really be surprised by Fischer's next move, as he played the move a3 himself. So he prefers to open the b file, but not weaken the dark squares. So keep this in mind as we progress forward in the video, and this will, I think, make it very easy for you to understand White's idea later on. So b takes a3, b takes a3, knight a5, knight a3. Now again, both sides are just playing on their wings. Bishop a6, bishop h3. White is targeting these pawns. Maybe at some point there may be a sacrifice. For example, if the queen leaves the defense of the knight on d7, knight d5 can happen, and if e d5, then the knight on d7 is hanging. So d4, attacking the knight on e3, and now knight f1. It was possible to put the knight on g4, but Fischer wants to keep the d1 h5 diagonal open for the king. For the queen. So he wants to go knight g5, and then the queen can come to h5, targeting the h7 pawn. That's why he puts the knight on f1 and not on g4. So knight b6. I won't go too much into detail of how black could have played better. For example, bishop b7 and c4 were better options here, but that's less important. Okay. So knight g5, following the idea of an attack. The idea is to go queen h5. And now you see that the knight on g5 and the bishop on h3 are targeting this pawn on a6. The sacrifice may not work, yeah, but it's still a threat. Knight d5, centralizing the knight, targeting the bishop. Bishop drops back to d2, covering c3 and keeping an eye on the knight on a5. Bishop takes g5. Black decides to eliminate the knight because after queen h5 he would have been forced to do so in view of this threat on against the pawn on h7 with the mate. Bishop takes g5, queen d7, and queen h5, getting the queen closer to the king side. Rook fc8, and now knight d2. This is a very common theme in the King's Indian attack, that this knight on f1 can stay there for a while, but at a certain point will get activated via either d2. Going to h2 was also possible. When it can come to g4, but Fischer prefers d2 and e4, because from e4 targets f6 like from g4, but also targets the d6 pawn. So this is a bit more flexible. Knight c3, stopping knight e4. Yeah, but now the knight is no longer controlling the f6 square, and it allows Fischer to start a very beautiful attack with the move bishop f6. Very often in the King's Indian attack, White is aiming for the weakening of the dark squares around the black king. So now gf6, ef6 was just fatal, because the king is too weak. Yeah, there will be some mating threats. Otherwise, the idea is to go queen g5 and basically mate on g7. So queen e8, so that the queen can join the defense from f8. Now knight e4. Fischer invites the exchange of the knights, because then the rook can join the attack via e4 and g4. g6, queen g5. The queen removes, not to h6 because there is queen f8, but to g5, as now h5 becomes an idea. Knight takes c4, rook takes c4, c4, and h5. And now the attack is unstoppable, because look at how many pieces are attacking. The rook is coming to h4, and after hg6, the h file will be open with decisive effect. C takes d3, rook h4. So Fischer is not wasting time on taking on d3. There is already an immediate threat. In case of dc2, h takes g6 leads to mate. Now hg6, rook h8 is mate immediately, whereas if f takes g6, rook takes h7. And then queen h4, queen h8, queen g7, mating. So black goes rook a7, defending the 7th rank. Yeah, but now bishop g2. This is a fantastic resource, as the bishop is aiming for the e4 square. So d takes e2 and queen h6. Now there is another threat, taking on g6 and mating on h8, queen f8, defending against mate on g7, but now the beautiful combination and the point of g2, queen takes h7. A beautiful, one of the most famous combinations by Bobby Fischer. Black resigned, because after taking on h7, h takes g6, it's a check. If the king goes to g8, there is rook h8 mate, and if the king takes on g6, there is bishop e4 mate. So that was the idea of bishop g2. So beautiful game, a beautiful combination, and a very nice demonstration of white's attacking possibilities in the King's Indian attack. So with this game in mind, okay, let's now go back to the starting position and let me show you the idea that I saw at the Spanish League. So the game starts with knight f3. So white is going directly for the King's Indian attack, not going e4, but first fianchettoing. So d5, as I said, this idea is applicable when black is trying to play the Queen's Gambit decline setup. So g3, knight f6, bishop g2 e6, castles, bishop e7, d3, and short castle. And here we are. Yeah? And this is the position where the idea actually happens. Now, I show you the game Fischer-Grandmaster, but there is also one other point that this idea has. Now, if white plays the automatic move knight bd2, or the one that is part of the King's Indian attack, black has the quite annoying and annoying in the sense that it's a character changing move, and that is the move knight c6. So black won't play c5, let's say e4, when you have the King's Indian attack, and that's what white is aiming for, but rather black can play the move knight c6. And in fact, this is the move I actually proposed in my lifetime repertoire on Chessable based on the Queen's Gambit decline. I realized that black is like, I think, not too happy to allow this attack on the king and so forth, so I was looking for ways for black to change the character of the position by not allowing this automatic attack. And I ran into this move knight c6, which looks a bit strange at first sight, but the idea of the move is actually to control the e5 square and go for the move e5. So the idea of the move is white, let's say, goes e4, black can take on e4 and then go e5. And then there is no King's Indian attack, there is no attack, there is nothing, and black successfully changed the character of the game. So obviously this is nice for black, but not so great for white. So the white players, and I think it was Amin who came up with this first, maybe I'm wrong, but the move in this position that I witnessed is the move a3. Yeah, and then if you put all this together that just I explained, the idea that Fischer employed, playing e3, yeah, not allowing black's a3, you may say, okay, this is too far ahead, like what's the whole point? But it's a useful move in the King's Indian attack, stopping black's a3 as we saw in the Fischer game. And also there is a second point, and the second point being that it avoids black's, let's say, character changing plan with knight c6. So the plan is that if now knight c6 with the idea of e5, white has the move b4. That's why a3 was necessary. b4 intending b5, so there is no e5, as then b5 and knight e5 would win a pawn. And after a6, bishop b2, controlling the e5 square. So now there is not really isn't a King's Indian attack on the board, but on the other hand, white has a quite comfortable reti position, yeah, with this awkward knight on c6, and white can continue with c4, knight c3, or knight bd2 and c4, and so forth. And black is suffering from this awkward knight on c6 and the still undeveloped light squared bishop on c8. So this is one of the main ideas, yeah, like I said, that black is kind of discouraged from going for the knight c6 idea thanks to this move b4. Now, of course, the idea is that if black continues with c5, then after knight bd2, knight c6, e4, we have the King's Indian attack with this useful move a3, as we saw from the Fischer game. When black starts advancing, b5, a5, and so forth, black won't have the idea of a5, a4, a3 at his disposal because white's pawn is already on a3. So this is a useful addition to the to white's position in the King's Indian attack. Now, what other options does black have? Well, he can go a5. It makes sense, yeah. Stops b4, and maybe now black wants to go knight c6 and e5. But here, I mean, for example, play the move knight c3. b3 and going for the reti is also an alternative. But knight c3 is more, let's say, in the spirit of the flexibility of white's position, and it aims to take advantage of this b5 square that has been somewhat weakened. With the knight on c3, the ideas with e4 are also, of course, valid again because the knight supports the advance. In case of d4, the knight nicely slots on b5, attacking the pawn on d4, yeah, and after e5, a4. So thanks to the move a5, white managed to establish control of these light squares. So now if c6, the knight will drop back to a3 and then join the game via c4, targeting the pawn on e5. And as usual in the King's Indian with black, here with the King's Indian attack with white, white will undermine black center by e3, yeah, or maybe switch to King's Indian structures with e4, and then going standard play, moving the knight from f3, f4, and so forth. Yeah. So this is another idea, going for after a5, going knight c3, and after d4, knight b5, and after e5, a4, like locking in these light squares on the queen side. And another, I think the last sensible option that we should cover is the move b6, which is sort of a flexible way. Yeah. And now white has a choice. He can go knight bd2, yeah, and then let's say go for the e4 push. But even though after bishop b7, e4, d4, white will have to go something like knight g5 and capture on e4 with the knight. But I think it's more aggressive to go e4 immediately. The point being that white can use the somewhat weakened long diagonal by black's last move b6 to execute the push immediately. Now critical for black is to take on e4, because if not, then white can go e5 and we have the King's Indian attack and what white wanted to do with the automatic knight bd2, rook e1, knight f1, h4, and so forth, again with the useful move a3, whereas black has played the move b6 rather than b5, which means that his queenside play comes in slower. So let's see, d takes e4, d takes e4, yeah, and now black can choose to accept the pawn sacrifice or not. Well, in either case, black has pretty good play. Let's check what happens if black takes the pawn. Knight takes e4, queen takes d8, and now bishop d8. Not obvious, but it is the better recapture, and the point is that after rook d8, knight g5 is very strong. So the knight is attacked and it's pinned, and the point of the move knight g5 is that after bishop g5, bishop g5, the bishop is attacking the rook and the knight is hanging. So after bishop g5, knight g5, bishop takes a8, white wins material. Now to understand the difference, let's go back and go bishop d8, and now if we go knight g5, bishop g5, bishop g5, the bishop on g5 is not attacking anything. So black can simply go bishop b7 and defend the knight, and then just go knight c5 or knight d6 and remain a pawn up. So you see now why it's important to capture on d8 with the bishop. Again, not very obvious, especially for the unprepared player. Nevertheless, we should expect our opponents to make the best moves. So we analyze bishop d8. Now knight fd2, attacking the knight on e4. Yeah. Knight takes d2, bishop takes d2. The rook is attacked, so c6 is the only move. Now bishop b4, attacking the rook and using the fact that this pawn on c6 cannot close the diagonal because that rook is still hanging. So rook e8 and now knight c3. Yeah. And it's a very unpleasant position for black. Let's say bishop b7, rook fd1, because he cannot, again, still move the c pawn because the bishop on b7 is hanging. In case of a5, the bishop can slot in on d6. And white has a very pleasant and comfortable compensation thanks to the weakening of that d6 square where the knight can land. Black has difficulties developing. The knight on b8 cannot actually move because then that allows rook d7. Yeah, as we mentioned, the pawn on c6 is pinned. So white has good compensation for the pawn here. Again, making it kind of having a very nice position to play. So this happens when black captures the pawn on e4, and in case of not capturing the pawn, let's say queen takes d1, rook takes d1, bishop b7. Now white of course goes e5 in King's Indian attack fashion, and after knight fd7, bishop f4, the standard moves, defending the pawn, h6 let's say, threatening g5, h4, standard stuff as well, and now rook d8. Rook d8 to defend the knight on d7 so that the knight from b8 can develop. Otherwise the knight from b8 cannot develop because the knight on d7 is hanging. So let's say rook d8 and now simply knight c3. So we have a complex endgame, but white is again quite comfortable, especially as black is a bit cramped and still not easy to finish development, whereas white has the simple plan of just doubling on the d file and increasing the pressure on the knight and the d file in general. So there you have it. This interesting idea a3, I think it's quite fresh, surprising also, and I think it poses quite, let's say, challenging practical problems to black when they choose the Queen's Gambit declined setup against the King's Indian attack. So I hope you like this video. Yeah, kind of new ideas. Yeah, please comment on it if you like it. Yeah, and now comes the Hikaru moment. Smash that subscribe button and send all your good vibes. So thanks for watching, guys, and comments, I'm looking forward to reading them, and I'll see you soon again. Cheers.